Good morning, everybody. If you're here in Australia, and good afternoon or good evening if you are elsewhere in the world. My name is Michelle Grossman, and it is a pleasure to welcome you today to the February AVERT webinar. Before we begin, as is customary here in Australia, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And in my case, you may be on Indigenous lands elsewhere, wherever you're sited, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, it is both a pleasure and a real honor to introduce to you Professor Dr. Rick Peels, who will be speaking to us on cognitive and behavioral radicalization and explanatory split. Professor Peels holds a university research chair in the Faculty of Religion and Theology at the Free University Amsterdam. He specializes in the ethics and epistemology of belief and is the lead investigator on the innovative European Research Council and EU-funded Extreme Beliefs Project. This is an extraordinarily wonderful project, and if you'd like to find out more about it, of course, you can just Google Extreme Beliefs Project. Among Rick's most recent books are Ignorance with Oxford University Press, 2023, and also Monotheism and Fundamentalism, Cambridge University Press, 2024. Rick is also the main editor of the Oxford University Press Extreme Belief and Behaviour series, which is running from 2024 to 2026. Just before I hand over to Rick, a couple of housekeeping things. We will have time for questions and dialogue with Rick, of course, at the end of his presentation. Please put your questions using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Please put your questions using the Q&A button, the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and not the chat function, which will make it easier for all of us to be able to manage and moderate the session as we go. And with that, Rick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me. I would also like to thank Isel for setting this up. I'm looking forward to this. And well, good morning, good afternoon, good night to all of you, depending on where you are. So let me try to start the PowerPoint. All right, this looks good to me. It works, right? Play from the very start. There we go. Right, so today I would like to explore with you the relation between cognitive and behavioral radicalization, and in particular this idea that there is an explanatory split between the two. Now, it may seem intuitive to lay people, and also many academics that are not that familiar with the debate on radicalization, that there is something like a natural relation between cognitive radicalization and behavioral radicalization, namely that cognitive radicalization normally leads to behavioral radicalization, or in other words, that people who think more extremely are likely to act more extremely. However, a well-known point made in literature, and we all know this, made by various leading scholars, is that there is no such clear relation. Belief that the use of violence is justified in a way predicts the actual use of violence. Thus, the point is often made, cognitive radicalization plays only a small or negligible role in explaining behavioral radicalization. There is an explanatory split between the two, and let me display it in this way. I will argue today that we need to reconsider this principle. There is a narrow sense in which it may be true, that is to be determined, but there are more important, equally or more important senses of this principle in which it is in all likelihood false. And I think that matters. So let me display it this way. The relation is to be explored in more detail. I think this matters because, among other things, the broader versions of the principle have shielded off relevant trajectories of research, and because this has profound implications for policy and intervention planning. So that's what I will argue today and explore with you. By way of preliminary I will treat cognitive and behavioral radicalization as two distinct phenomena. And of course, reality is way more complex when it comes to this. So very often they cannot neatly be separated. So think, for instance, of participating in an online training camp of an extremist organization. That doesn't seem purely cognitive. It doesn't seem purely behavioral either. It seems something in between. So these concepts have blurry boundaries. Also, if there is a partially causal relation, then behavior will probably influence cognition at least as much as the other way around. Cognition is itself partly behavioral. Behavior is crucially dependent on cognition, so we cannot neatly separate the two. But of course, in the same way that we cannot neatly separate darkness and light, there is a moment in between. That doesn't imply that there is no darkness and light, right? And similarly, we can make a rough and ready distinction between cognitive and behavioral radicalization, where cognitive radicalization has primarily to do with what one thinks and how one thinks, whereas behavioral radicalization has to do with what one does and how one does it. So, that by way of preliminary. Let's now move on to the explanatory split principle. So, the explanatory split principle was first presented in response to what was called the conveyor belt model, a term introduced by Zeno Barron. I don't think she actually embraces this idea, but she uses the notion. And this conveyor belt model says that extreme beliefs directly lead to extreme actions. And the explanatory split principle was formulated as a response to this. And an example of this is the work of Clark Macaulay and Sofia Moskalenko, for instance, when they construct these two famous pyramids. So the opinion radicalization pyramid on the left and the action radicalization pyramid on the right. So on the left, when it comes to cognitive radicalization, people move from neutral to sympathizers to justifiers to feeling a personal moral obligation. Whereas when it comes to the action radicalization pyramid, people move from inert to activist to radical to terrorist. And the idea is that there is an explanatory split between the two. So cognitive radicalization doesn't figure, or very often doesn't figure, in an explanation of behavioral radicalization. There's a split between the two. And the idea is that many people with beliefs that justify or otherwise condone violence never actually join a militant group. And from that point, they derive something of a more general principle, which they formulate, for instance, in this book, but also in other places, the well-known Friction book from 2017, but also in other places. They come up with this broader conclusion, and they say the great majority with radical ideas do not take radical action. And when they formulate it that way, they have moved from the rather limited point about the lack of correlation between beliefs about the use of violence on the one hand and the actual use of violence on the other, to this more general principle: radical ideas do not lead to radical action. Here's another formulation that we find in their work. The two kinds of radicalization, in opinion and in action, are not directly related. In fact, most people with radical opinion will never do anything radical. Okay. Now you may wonder, what is the evidential basis for this? So how do they come up with this view? And here's a quote that illustrates that, a rather long quote. Here's what they say: when action consistent with beliefs and feeling is costly, for instance, when it comes to terrorism, the gap between belief and action is likely to be large. The gap between belief and action is evident in the contrast between polling data and security reports in the UK, where 5% of adult Muslims saw reported suicide attacks as justified, but only several hundred terrorism-related arrests have been made since 9/11. And they go on. The gap between opinion and action is also evident in case histories of terrorists. Macaulay and Moskalenko, so here they refer to earlier work of themselves, examined case histories ranging from anti-Tsarist Russian terrorists of the late 1800s to anti-Western Muslim terrorists of the late 1900s, and identified 12 mechanisms of radicalization. At least 3 of these mechanisms do not depend on radical ideas. And they take this to be an instantiation of a more general phenomenon. The idea is that when it comes to extreme behavior generally, so not just that related to extremism and terrorism, but generally, the relation between attitude, cognitive attitude or doxastic attitude on the one hand, and behavior on the other is usually weak. So, for instance, they also point to the fact that very few, only 5% of college students with suicidal thoughts actually attempt suicide, fortunately. Only a tiny percentage of students with homicidal fantasies actually act on them, and anger about discrimination of one's group rarely leads to protests. So it's a general point. Now, if we look at the literature, very often there's also a point made about the opposite relation. So people can behaviorally radicalize in the absence of any extreme beliefs or beliefs about the use of violence or the absence of cognitive radicalization. And an example of someone who makes this point is John Horgan. So here's a quote. There's evidence that not all those who engage in violent behavior necessarily need to possess radical beliefs. An argument carefully supported by such research as that of Kiljulin's thesis on how, I do hope I pronounce the name correctly, on how counterinsurgency and counterterrorism breed accidental guerrillas. The lingering question in terrorism research or studies is whether violent beliefs precede violent action, and it seems to be the case that while they often do, it is not always the case. And others go on and combine these two ideas. So cognitive radicalization doesn't need to lead to behavioral radicalization and the other way around into a single quote. And here's an example of that. Randy Borum, most people who harbor radical ideas and violent justifications do not engage in terrorism, just as many known terrorists, even many of those who carry a militant jihadi banner, are not especially pious and have only a cursory understanding of the radical religious ideology they claim to represent. And yet another example, and I'll, that will be it, is the work of Bart Schuurman and Max Taylor, when they say a central shortcoming of radicalization-based thinking remains its tendency to implicitly or explicitly see involvement in terrorism as stemming from the adoption of radical beliefs, even though the vast majority of radicals never become involved in terrorism, and not all terrorists are primarily motivated by their beliefs. Opinion surveys have found adherence to radical Islamist beliefs to be unrelated with support for terrorism. Strikingly, research has also shown that not all those who do become terrorists are primarily motivated by extremist ideologies. Now, before we move on, I think we should note a couple of things. So when we look at these quotations, there's quite a bit of variation among them. So some of these people make a point about the lack of a relation. Others about the lack of a correlation, still others about the lack of a temporal succession, yet others a point about the lack of causation, yet others about the lack of an explanation, and yet others about the lack of predictive power. And I could add further quotes to illustrate this. I will be focusing on the idea that there is an explanatory gap. And I will do that because I take it that explanation is a particular kind of relation that comes with temporal succession, that requires at least some correlation, and that entails at least a weak causal relation. So we have all the other relations except for predictive power. So I think that is a tricky and difficult one, and I will leave that one aside and just focus on explanation. I think a second point we should note before we move on is that some of these statements are specifically about the lack of correlation between radical or extreme beliefs about violence on the one hand and the actual use of violence. So John Horgan's quote is an example of that. But other statements are much broader. So they make a general claim about the adoption of radical beliefs on the one hand and radical action on the other. So Macaulay and Moskalenko are an example of that. And some of these other statements are somewhere in between the narrow and the broader version. So Schuurman and Taylor is an example of that. So that's a claim about radical beliefs and terrorism. So what I will argue today is that the highly narrow, the very specific versions may be tenable, but that the broadest ones are not, and the ones in between also not. So that's the point I will try to make. All right, let's move on to the criticisms. The first main criticism that I would like to level is that there's a problem with the scope of radicalization. And the first, so I'm going to illustrate this in three ways. The first one has to do with the evidence base. The evidence base that is adduced in favor of the explanatory split is often rather unspecific about the exact beliefs about violence. And here's an example to illustrate that point. So a quote from James Khalil's work. Where he says, for instance, the manpower estimates for the Taliban and other insurgent organizations in Afghanistan represented a minute fraction of the 29% of the population said to be sympathetic towards such groups in 2011. Similarly, those who support suicide attacks in the Palestinian territories, reportedly reaching 66% of the population in 2005, far outnumber those actually involved in producing this violence. Now, the point I would like to make here is that being sympathetic towards a violent extremist group is rather different. It's not identical to such beliefs as that the Taliban rightly uses violence, let alone the belief that one is oneself under an obligation to engage in such violence. And the same point, of course, holds for suicide attacks in the Palestinian territories. So there is a problem with these sweeping claims and the highly ambiguous evidence, unspecific evidence provided for it. A second point has to do with the scope of extremist beliefs. So cognitive radicalization has to do not just with beliefs about violence, say against one's political opponent or the government. It also has to do with other kinds of extremist beliefs. Beliefs such as women should receive only that education which is necessary for bearing children and running the household, or homosexual actions and in fact mere inclinations are sinful and should be punished, or democracy is a violation of the divine law, or people beyond our own group are godless and morally depraved, or we are run by a cabal of satanistic, child-abusing pedophiles, things like that. Right. None of these beliefs is directly about violence or the legitimation of violence, and yet acquiring such beliefs or becoming more convinced of them or giving them a more central place in one's belief system are all instances of cognitive radicalization. The third point I would like to make here is that cognitive radicalization is not even limited to extreme beliefs. One can also cognitively radicalize by adopting or embracing particular thinking styles, such as paranoia or a conspiracy mentality. One can cognitively radicalize by nurturing character traits that make changing one's mind more difficult, so-called epistemic vices, things like dogmatism, narrow-mindedness, black and white thinking, epistemic arrogance, epistemic insouciance, and so on. So if we confine cognitive radicalization to extreme beliefs, let alone extreme beliefs about violence only, we will miss out on important dimensions of cognitive radicalization. I think a similar point holds for behavioral radicalization. So behavioral radicalization is not just about violent action, it is also about numerous kinds of non-violent action, such as discriminating against homosexuals by not hiring them, expelling women from education in Afghanistan, for instance, refusing to confer the same legal rights on people of other faiths and races, resisting democratic institutions and principles, demonizing one's opponent, and so on. And I think it's important in this context to emphasize that extremism is perhaps not even usually violent. So most extremism has to do, on standard definitions like those of J.M. Berger or Qasim Qassam, most of it has to do with othering, with demonizing one's opponent or posing a threat to democratic institutions, and not necessarily violence. There is, of course, also terrorism, and terrorism is more closely related to violence as it is by definition the use or threat of violence. So it is conceptually more closely tied to violence. But even that doesn't imply that most terrorists are violent. So in Western countries, in most Western countries, most people convicted for terrorism are not convicted for performing violent acts, but for spreading propaganda, for recruiting, for financially supporting, for theologically justifying actions like that. Right. So what I'm advocating is that these general broad statements about the lack of explanatory, the lack of an explanatory connection between cognitive and behavioral radicalization are insufficiently supported by the evidence and overlook the scope, the true scope of extremist beliefs and the nature of cognitive and behavioral radicalization. And I want to point out that this leaves room for highly specific versions of an explanatory split principle. So here's one example of a more specific one. Donald Holbrook and John Horgan. When they say notions of ideology and the emergence of terrorism can be clarified and conflicting depictions of its role and agency in these processes can be reconciled if we arrive at a non-binary conceptualization of ideology that emphasizes interpretations of social identity over depictions of the doctrinal. Ideology is thus something that is fluid, not rigid, and not something that either does or does not impact individuals depending on their substantive engagement with its content. Ideology is not something they either possess or do not possess, and its impact can best be understood by virtue of the way in which the perception of their environment is shaped. So here they have a nuanced understanding of the relation between the two. So cognitive radicalization may lead to behavioral radicalization, but it doesn't have to. And we need to take into account the fact that ideology, for instance, is not static but fluid, that social identity matters more to the role of ideology in explaining terrorism than the doctrinal, and so on. Right. Let me move on to my second major objection against the broad versions of the explanatory split principle. That has to do with radicalization on a group level. It's undeniable that radicalization regularly happens in groups. So here we can think of relatively tightly structured groups like the German Rote Armee-Fraktion or the youth branch of the Alternative für Deutschland, but equally of less well-structured groups like maybe generally all American QAnon conspiracy theorizers or all Hungarian white Christian nationalists. And we even find radicalization in social entities like institutions, ministries, organizations, and governments. So the current Russian government would be a painful example of that. And I think we can all think of at least one other government that comes to mind. Now, the evidence that scholars like Moskalenko and Macaulay provide in favor of the general explanatory split is merely about individuals. And I think that matters because we do know from social epistemology and group psychology that individual belief has a radically different constitution than, so individual has a radically different constitution than group belief. And various group dynamics can ensure that belief is maintained and shaped differently. And I think there are numerous reasons why, for instance, an individual Islamist extremist who believes that the use of violence is justified is not thereby particularly likely to commit such violence himself. And the same thing, of course, holds for, say, a right-wing extremist. And there may be various reasons for the lack of an explanatory relation that are absent in the case of groups, where the tie may be much closer. And I will give 4 of those reasons here. The first one is lack of resources. So an individual may believe that the use of violence against a military or a politician is permissible or even required, and yet not engage in that violence because, for instance, they cannot lay their hands on the weapons or other material. It is undeniable, of course, that groups generally have significantly more resources than individuals, so that the chances of a group's lacking resources to perform a violent action are usually much smaller than those of an individual. The second reason is slightly more philosophical in nature, if you will forgive me. The second reason is what in ethics is widely called weakness of will or akrasia. So to act from akrasia is to act against one's better judgment, that is, against one's current and conscious beliefs. And such akrasia is not that rare. So for instance, you can sincerely believe that you shouldn't finish that bag of chips while you're watching a movie, and yet you do. Or you sincerely believe that you ought to spend less time on your iPhone, and yet you find yourself swiping through Insta or TikTok all the time. Similarly, a person may sincerely believe that the use of violence is entirely legitimate, perhaps even that he or she, himself or herself, ought to engage in such violent action, and yet fail to act in accordance with that belief. And given the potential cost of acting in accordance with that belief, being incarcerated or even dying, the lack of corresponding action makes perfect sense. Now, of course, groups can also act against their better judgment, so from akrasia, against their ideology. But chances seem smaller generally, so members of a group may remind each other of what they stand for. There's group pressure. Ideology provides a group identity that one shouldn't deviate from too much, and so on. So that's a second reason. The third reason has to do with feeling unqualified. An individual may believe that the use of violence against someone or something is justified, and yet that they are not the right person to do so. They are not qualified. They may be physically not strong enough, too old. It may be the duty of the other gender, males only, for instance. One may think that one has insufficient training in the use of weapons. Maybe one feels one ought to take care of one's children or one's parents. One may lack the religious authorization to do so, and so on, numerous reasons. And of course, for groups, generally, this is somewhat different as they have larger numbers of people on board, so that the chances for the right gender or age or experience or authorization and so on do increase. And finally, there is group dynamics. And this is because there are also factors that are unique to groups that all by themselves actually increase the chances that cognitive radicalization on a group level will lead to, so translate to behavioral radicalization on a group level. So here you can think of such things as the fact that groups act more competitively than individuals. There are the effects of groupthink, in which a desire for conformity among a group's members leads to an irrational decision-making outcome. There is the risky shift phenomenon, in which group interaction moves individuals within that group to more extreme positions. Group support can make high levels of cognitive dissonance bearable. And all these phenomena allow engaging in extreme behavior even when individuals within the groups have expressed doubts when on their own. Right, so this is the second major worry that I have about the general explanatory split principle that posits that there is no explanatory relation between individual cognitive radicalization and behavioral radicalization. So things change when we look at the group level. All right, time for some discussion. So I've argued that groups have features unique to them that increase the chances of cognitive radicalization actually translating into behavioral radicalization. But one might wonder, can groups not equally well temper individuals' escalatory trends towards violent action? And this is something that Joel Busher, Holbrook, and Macklin have argued. And they speak of what they call internal brakes on violent escalation. And they define them as, quote, the mechanisms through which members of the groups themselves contribute to establish and maintain limits upon their own violence, end quote. And they've developed a descriptive typology in terms of 5 such kinds of breaks. And they also have sub-breaks, but I'll focus on the 5 main kinds of breaks here that they distinguish. First, strategic logic. That is identification of non-violent or less violent strategies of action as more effective than violent alternatives. There's also second, a moral logic, so the construction of moral norms that inhibit certain forms of violence. Third, the logic of ego maintenance, self-identification as a group that is either non-violent or uses only limited violence. The logic of out-group definition, so boundary softening in relation to putative out-groups. And finally, organizational logic, so that is organizational developments that alter the moral and strategic equations in favor of non-violence or limited violence, or institutionalize less violent collective identities. So different kinds of breaks that groups used when it comes to violence. And they've actually also empirically applied this typology to different kinds of groups. So they've shown how this works for British jihadi groups between 2001 and 2016, the British extreme right during the 1990s, and the UK animal liberation movement between the mid-1970s and the early 2000s. So one might wonder, is there indeed a chance that there is a stronger correlation between cognitive and behavioral radicalization on the level of groups? Or should we rather think that there are actually breaks? So chances are maybe even smaller on a group level. Right. And I think this doesn't defeat my objection against the general understanding for 3 reasons. So, and let me emphasize that I find all of this highly insightful. I just don't think it defeats the point. First, if we look closer at each of these movements that I just mentioned and what they stand for, I think we actually see a close correlation. So take, for instance, the British animal liberation movement. As a whole, that movement did not support violence against human beings. It was not the group belief or the group ideology that violence against humans was legitimate. There were a couple of group members who did call for violence. So people like Jerry Vlasak, for instance, when he spoke about violence against vivisectors. But those people were exceptional, and those ideas did not actually turn into group ideology. So they didn't turn into what the group stood for. And actually, the group as a group did never use violence against humans. It was, however, clearly part of the group's ideology that violence against various buildings, for instance, was legitimate, and in fact it did commit such violence. So, for instance, arson attacks against meat processing plants and lumber companies. So actually, we see a rather close correlation between cognitive radicalization, so the group ideology, and behavioral radicalization, so the use of violence. Second, I think what we see in these cases is not so much that the group ideology dictates violence and then somehow fails to commit such violence. I think the proper analysis in these cases is rather that the group leadership sets the parameters for what is considered to be acceptable violence. So violence is not rejected altogether, rather it is controlled. So I don't think this shows that there is an explanatory gap or defeats my objection against the general principle. And third, I don't deny that there are cases in which group ideology dictates that violence will be justified, and yet the group decides not to use violence, for instance, for strategic reasons. But I don't think it would be right to say that in such cases, the group acts contrary to their group belief or their group ideology. Rather, the group belief or group ideology is broader than merely beliefs about the legitimacy of violence. It is a larger belief system, and some beliefs within that belief system shed light on or qualify other beliefs within that belief system. So a group may believe that violence is justified, but then also that it is unwise to use it in specific circumstances for strategic reasons. Those go well together. So we need to consider the larger web of belief, so to say. All right. We're almost there. A few ramifications of what I've argued. 6 to be precise, so quite a few. First, we should identify in radicalized individuals and groups elements of cognitive radicalization other than beliefs about the legitimacy of violence, and also elements of behavioral radicalization other than the actual use of violence, in order then to systematically explore to what extent various correlations do or do not hold between them. So one can take, for instance, the current Russian government, and it doesn't seem unlikely that on a group level, the group ideology, so what the government stands for when it comes to homophobia, for instance, or racism, or the master narrative of Russia as a Christian country, translates to behavioral radicalization. And I think that is, in fact, exactly what we witness these days, also towards Ukraine, by the way. Second, we should disambiguate extreme beliefs and understand them in the context of larger webs of beliefs. And I think this holds even for extreme beliefs about violence. So, for instance, is the belief that the use of political violence is possible, or that it is legitimate, or that it is justified, or that it is mandatory? What does the belief say about the nature and the scope of that violence? What does the belief say about who is allowed to use such violence, or who bears that obligation? What does the belief say about against whom such violence is allowed? And what does the belief say about the conditions under which, or the restrictions under which such violence is justified? So I think radical beliefs about violence are often highly specific. For instance, I am under an obligation to join the holy struggle against Assad's regime to defend my Muslim brothers and sisters. Highly specific beliefs. And moreover, even after such disambiguation, they should be understood in the larger context of the belief web of which they are a part. After all, such extreme beliefs can be accompanied by meta-beliefs, auxiliary beliefs, and other beliefs that qualify them, nuance them, put restrictions on them, give them a particular place in a hierarchy of beliefs, or maybe even provide a particular urgency to them. Think of millenarian or other apocalyptic beliefs. Or don't give them urgency. That's also a possibility. All right, third point, third ramification. We should identify factors that prevent individuals and groups who have cognitively radicalized to translate that to behavioral radicalization. Here we can think of lack of resources, deemed lack of qualification, and akrasia. And for some of these, such as lack of resources, we can rely on existing databases and case studies. But for other ones, for instance, when it comes to akrasia, we may need theory from ethics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of psychology, in addition to data. Fourth, we should study both theoretically, so using the sources of social epistemology, for instance, and empirically, for instance, using the sources of group psychology, how group cognitive and behavioral radicalization differs from, but is related to individual cognitive and behavioral radicalization. and identify commonalities and crucial differences. And I think this can be really fruitful. So to give you one example, Russell Hardin has famously argued that extremist groups have their own dynamics that contribute to developing what he calls a crippled epistemology. So, for instance, self-isolation that excludes other voices. And I think this is close to what we would nowadays call epistemic bubbles or echo chambers. And inspired by Hardin's work, Michael Bauermann has, with a few colleagues, identified a specific social epistemic mechanism that can help explain how extremist beliefs in groups arise and stay and erode over time. So that will be an example of that. Fifth ramification. We should study both theoretically and empirically what such things as group belief are in the first place in the case of extremist and terrorist groups. So we know from social epistemology that what a group believes, and thus what matters in exploring a potential correlation or explanatory relation even between cognitive and behavioral radicalization on a group level, is not simply a matter of what the members of the group believe. In fact, it's possible that what the group believes deviates from most, and in some cases, what all of the members believe. Right? So, for instance, when there's too much divergence in opinion so that they decide to settle on a compromise. Sixth, and finally, we should study the mechanisms in groups that may raise the correlation between cognitive and behavioral radicalization in groups. So some scholars have argued that given the allegedly weak correlation between beliefs about the legitimacy of using violence and the actual use of violence, we should in CVE programs, so countering violent extremism, move from a focus on radical ideas and ideology to a focus on radical behavior. But if what I've argued is right, we should go for a somewhat more nuanced approach. So surely radical ideas play only a limited role in explaining processes of behavioral radicalization. Numerous other factors also contribute. And it may not even be the primary driver. And yet there is ample reason to think that extreme beliefs and other forms of cognitive radicalization often play some important role in the process of behavioral radicalization for individuals and perhaps even more so for groups. And I think we therefore need pluriform CVE programs that also do engage radical beliefs, ideology, and other dimensions of cognitive radicalization. So 6 ramifications. Time to draw a conclusion. I think there may well be a kernel of truth to the explanatory split principle. If so, however, given the current evidence base, it will have to confine itself to a claim about the lack of an explanatory relation between beliefs about the legitimate use of violence on the one hand and the actual use of violence on the other for individuals. And of course, nothing follows from that about a general explanatory split between cognitive and behavioral radicalization. Such principles are simply not warranted. And of course, this is not a plea to go back to a conveyor belt model of radicalization. And I think we have seen that reality is way more complex. And I think what this shows is that we need to explore a more complex relationship between cognitive and behavioral radicalization without a full-blown explanatory split. And an example of that I would like to mention is the first volume in the Extreme Belief in Behavior series that Michel already mentioned, kindly. And this is a volume that has just been published by Beatrice de Graaf, and its title is The Radical Redemption Model, Terrorist Beliefs and Narratives. And it explores, among other things, the motivation for jihadis to travel to Syria. So this is a qualitative study with convicted terrorists. And the basic idea is that they embrace a radical redemption narrative. So they feel guilty about not doing much while then President Assad murdered his own civilians, and they feel they are under a duty to join the holy struggle, the holy fight, and to redeem themselves. And what she argues is that it's not merely about beliefs, it's also about a narrative and orthopraxis, so living right rather than merely believing rightly. And religiosity here is not so much a dependent or independent variable as it is a moderating variable. So it provides the material, this radical narrative and this search for purity to interpret, for instance, this feeling of guilt. So I think this is an instantiation, an embodiment, an example of a more nuanced understanding between of the relation between cognitive and behavioral radicalization that does not posit this explanatory split that is, as far as I can see, not in any way warranted by the evidence base as things stand. So I think um, this calls for a more nuanced understanding, and I've tried to suggest various options that can be explored in the future, and I hope you will join that exploration. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rick, for this absolutely fascinating and very, very rich talk. While people are gathering their thoughts in terms of questions that they might like to pose, and everybody who is on the call, I encourage you to please post your questions using the Q&A tab. And of course, we will take them then in the order that we receive them. But while people are gathering their thoughts, Rick, let me start with a couple of questions of my own. So
Yep.
one of the peculiarities around radicalization in terms of its characteristics around both momentum and change in relation to norms is, when does it stop being radical? So I want to put another kind of proposition to you in terms of your critique. So if we're critiquing the relationship between cognitive and behavioral radicalization, what is your view on the proposition that cognitive radicalization actually leads to behavioral normalization at a certain point? In other words, as you cognitively radicalize, as a group cognitively radicalizes, the behavior that they adopt that might be considered radical, it only stays that way for a time, and then it becomes normalized. Yes, it becomes legitimized. It becomes part and parcel. So there, I think for me, one of the things that's potentially missing in this analysis
Yeah.
is the reality of what one can call shifting norms that are
Mhm.
associated with processes of normalization. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a great question, Michelle. So I think I'm with you on this one. I kind of wanted to zoom in rather narrowly, perhaps, on this supposed explanatory split between the two, right? And see to what extent that is justified by the evidence and whether the conceptual underpinnings of that are right, or whether maybe they work with a mistaken understanding of the nature of cognitive and behavioral radicalization, or maybe too limited a scope of the two. And that's what I've tried to argue. Um, there may be parts of an explanatory split between the two in some regards, but that is to be investigated. I just don't think we should unqualifiedly kind of embrace this broader statement. And I think you're right in asking, what about shifting norms? And is one function of cognitive radicalization to normalize radicalized behavior so that it's no longer perceived within the group as radical behavior?
Yeah.
Um,
I,
so
I,
that
I
is
have
a yeah.
I have in
Yeah, so
mind
that
the
is a
United States. I have in mind the United States here. So at what
yeah,
point, as we've charted, and I would be arguing that we are witnessing mass radicalization in the
yeah.
U.S. At the moment. At what point do behaviors that were considered highly or deeply radical, such as the January 6th assault on the Capitol,
Insurrection.
at what point
Yeah,
do they become normed? Yes, that's an example of where I'm going with this.
right. Yeah, yeah. And so freeing all the people and pardoning them is one way of normalizing such behavior, right? Yeah, and so that would be another interesting instance where you might think some people have cognitively radicalized, other people have behaviorally radicalized, maybe without cognitively radicalizing too much. So some of the people might be in it for the money, for instance, or for other reasons. Um, but clearly, I think some cognitive radicalization explains what we see. Yeah, so I'm with you. I need to do more work on these shifting norms and normalization and the mechanisms of normalization.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, great
Okay.
question. Thank you.
Um, I'm not seeing any questions. There's a comment in the Q&A which says was fantastic. Thank you. Cheers from Canada. So that's a
Okay,
lovely
great.
comment. So
Oh,
perhaps people are still thinking of questions that they might like to ask. Let me continue with another question of mine, and then I see we do have a second question that's come up in the chat. This is really more of a comment on some of the empirical dimensions of what you've touched on. So you mentioned conviction. You mentioned what people get convicted for in various countries, and you point out that often those convictions are not related to acts of violence. But they are related to things like the dissemination of propaganda. So this has to do with the how wide or how narrowly the net is constructed in relation to legislation. But I'm wondering if you think that there is a kind of empirical correlative here, which is that often the reason that people get convicted of non-violent acts is because their plots have been disrupted before they can get to the violence. In other words, how reliable are conviction rates given
yeah,
the impetus to interdict and disrupt terrorist planning? We've got a well established phenomena like leakage. People sort of, leak their plans or, bleed them out. There's intelligence gathering of various kinds. So I'm not entirely convinced that conviction rates are a reliable empirical measure to make the point around violent or nonviolent behavior. And again, I would
yeah,
welcome
yeah.
your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah. So the point would still stand for extremism, right? Um, I mean, there's also cases of being convicted there, but of course, but I was trying to make a point about terrorism. So that I think you're quite right that the actual conviction rates might not um, um, give us a full disclosure of the extent of behavioral radicalization as someone intervenes in the process, right? And if the process were to be unimpeded, it might actually end up with behavioral radicalization in the form of violence. So one thing to be explored there is also the roles that people have within terrorist organizations. So even if not discovered at some point and without any intervention, what number of terrorists would actually employ violence themselves? And I think, right, and I think even then you might think there is still a division of
Mm,
tasks at work. And
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, but so I wouldn't have the numbers, but I would figure that even then maybe the majority of them wouldn't actually have the
Yeah.
task of
Yeah.
employing violence themselves, right?
Agreed. Agreed. Okay. Thank you. That was a really great clarification. We do have now a bunch of questions in
Okay,
the
great. Yeah.
Q&A, so let's get started with those. So the first question is, in your conception, do you think that ideology would occupy a similar influence on behavioral radicalization as cognitive disposition, for example, mental health, autism, other neurological conditions?
Right, a similar influence. Right. So there's of course nowadays a lot of debate on psychopathological explanations of radicalization, including that of terrorism. And some people like John Horgan do defend something of a normalcy hypothesis, saying that of course there is psychopathology among, say, terrorists or violent extremists as well, but it generally is quite a bit of psychopathology among populations. So is this not to say that it won't be there or that it might not play a role, but it doesn't function as a categorical explanation? And we need further research, such as that of Emily Corner, to see what role it exactly plays in different movements also. So you might think, for instance, that when it came to the insurrection at the Capitol, specific kinds of psychopathology or post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance, play a more significant role than given the people from the with experiences in the military in Iraq and Afghanistan involved on that occasion. So the psychopathology there might differ from the psychopathology in, I don't know, the Rote Armee-Fraktion, for instance, with a different history. Um, I think one important difference is that, of course, by definition, all extremist groups do have an ideology. And you might think that therefore some kind of cognitive radicalization, at least on a group level, is constitutive of explanations of behavioral radicalization, whereas this doesn't necessarily hold for psychopathological explanations. And of course, it's easier also to translate ideology on an individual level to that on a group level, taking into account social epistemology, than it is to do so for psychopathology. So I think there's some work on psychopathological properties on group levels, right? So for groups. But I think other people would say that is merely metaphorical. So that's another crucial difference between the two.
Okay.
So no, I would be very careful to say, I would not be inclined to say that they play a similar influence on
Mm.
behavioral radicalization. I would say they're quite distinct generally. So that was a long answer.
Okay, thank you. The next question that we have is more practically oriented, which is asking for your comment on what you see as the implications of your theoretical exploration of these differences between cognitive and behavioral radicalization. What does this mean for those people who are working in the field of countering violent extremism in terms of how you translate some of these insights to make them meaningful for policy and practice?
Right, yeah. So I think one thing that matters is that we shouldn't forego engaging the belief system and the ideology and related um, things like orthopraxy, for instance, for radicalized Christians or Muslims or Jews or other religious people. Take them seriously, but also learn to disambiguate them. So engage them and seek to fine-tune our analysis in qualitative research. So not asking whether people are sympathetic towards violence or not asking merely that, but also, do you think violence is allowed, justified, or even necessary, mandatory? Do you think you are justified in using it? Are you under an obligation towards whom? In virtue of what? So kind of flesh this out in way more detail. And that is just an example about beliefs about violence, but of course there are other kinds of cognitive and behavioral radicalization. So that would be a practical
It's
application.
an interesting point because I think I'm not sure that that kind of dialogue around violence and asking people what they actually think about
Mhm.
violence necessarily is a feature of all, in other words, there are a range of assumptions made about, violence that not being the right pathway without necessarily exploring the reasons why people do think it might be the right pathway before you try to disengage them from it. But anyway, that's, yeah,
Yeah, that
interesting
is
point.
true. Yeah, so
Um,
so at the background here is the a general, I think one important trait, so to say, or property of the book series, so the extreme belief and behavior series that you Michelle, already mentioned, is this idea that first person perspectives and accounts of, for instance, convicted terrorists and extremists do matter. And of course, they're not infallible and there may be agendas and the like, but it is pivotal to better understanding and explaining extremism to engage this first person perspective and the reasons people have for engaging in violence or
yeah.
becoming a member of an extremist group and the like. So that is one,
Mm.
but it's tricky. So it faces all sorts of methodological, epistemological, and ethical challenges like limits of empathy and the like. So those are the things we also seek to explore in the series.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. I'm going to move fairly quickly now through the remaining questions because I'm mindful of the time.
Um,
And I'm going to jump around a little bit too. The next question I'm going to go to, it's a comment followed by a question. The approach that you've taken seems to have some good links to the kind of person in place, person in context approaches from fields, broader fields such as social work, where there are efforts to consider norms and narratives as well as individual traits and behaviors. So this may be an oversimplification. The person asking this question says, but would you also see that kind of connection?
right. We have to consider norms and as well as individual traits and behavior. Yeah. Yeah. I would have to delve more into that, but so at first sight, there definitely does seem to be that connection. Yes. Um, I would have let me write down
Do
the
you want
name
to
of
take
this.
that on notice, do you?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I will reach out to Red. Yeah, that's great.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
In
Sorry for
relation
her.
to group dynamics, this is a fascinating question. In relation to group dynamics, can the same be said, as you've been arguing, for so-called positive movements? Or is there some stronger sense of radicalization for negative stroke destructive cognition and or behavior?
Right. So positive movements being non-extremist movements or non
I'm not sure, possibly pro-social.
yeah, pro-social. Yeah, some of the mechanisms that I mentioned under my fourth point under the second objection, sorry, is rather layered. Equally apply. They apply across groups generally, right? And there are also risks for certain groups. So things like groupthink. And in case the say the doctrine or the ideology or the belief system of a group is pro-social, that need not be a problem in a sense that these are beliefs that make people flourish and that are altruistic in nature, for instance. You might still think that they're epistemically problematic, right? In a sense that you're insufficiently open-minded towards other positions, for instance. Um, yeah, so is there a stronger, I need to think about this a bit more. So maybe a
Mhm.
stronger sense of relative to negative. Yeah,
It does remind me of the distinction between what we call radicalization versus radicalism, which we tend to
right.
associate, right, which we tend to associate with pro-social movements that have led to positive social change,
Yeah,
over time,
yeah,
women's rights, et
yeah.
cetera, et cetera,
Civil
considered
rights,
radical, but
Martin
also
Luther King.
positive. So, yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting whether it would be, I mean, you can imagine that similar relations may hold between, I don't know how to think of this, but positive or pro-social group ideology and pro-social behavior, right? Particularly maybe in the face of something you're interested in, Michelle, is adversity. You need some sort of ideological resilience as well to keep going in the face of oppressive measures, as was the case for the civil rights movement, for instance, in the United States.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. So it'll
good.
be interesting to compare the two. So which
Hmm.
which dynamics are similar and which ones are different? Yeah,
Great. All right. Look, thank you for that, Rick. I'll just note as we're about to close that there is also a comment that rightly points out that autism, this is in relation to an earlier part of the discussion, that
right.
autism, just in case anybody has this confusion, is not classed as a mental illness or a psych condition, that it is
Right.
just a neurodevelopmental disorder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, look,
Neurodiversity. Yeah.
unfortunately, that brings us to the close of our time together. So I'd like to both thank you, Rick, once again, and also thank everybody else for being here. The video recording of our session will be available on the website. Everybody, if you're not already on the AVERT mailing list, we do encourage you to jump on to the AVERT website and register to receive our newsletter and mailing list for future events. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can also find us on the AVERT YouTube channel. So just before we close, I'd also like to highlight the next two events that are coming up in the AVERT webinar series. One is a hybrid event where we have the Institute for Economics and Peace presenting their Global Terrorism Index 2025, and another webinar later in March called Advancements in Criminological Approaches to Terrorism and Violent Extremism. That is going to be moderated by Dr. Jared DeMello who is a member of our AVERT executive. So please stay tuned for our March events. More information about those will be released shortly. In the meantime, thank you once again for joining us wherever you are, and thank you once again, Rick.
My pleasure. Thanks so
Bye-bye,
much.
everybody.
All right, bye-bye.